Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Syracuse Sports Podcast. Once again, for another time in the past few weeks, not with Brent Axe, but with Emily Leiker and Chris Carlson. School is back in session, so Brent is teaching the younglings and is teaching his class up at SU tonight. So Chris and I wanted to hop on and talk a little bit about the depth chart, which we got officially this morning, right ahead of our first in-season press conference with Fran Brown, and then recap the final episode of ACC All-Access with Syracuse football, and really I think kind of like the entire show, and talk a little bit about what Syracuse gained from that and kind of the exposure of that. But Chris, let's start with the depth chart. I'm going to pop it up on screen here for a second as we get started. But what was kind of your immediate impression of the names we saw in here this morning?
I think we did a great job keeping people informed about the position battles was like my first reaction. Like, yeah, we did pretty good. I thought Amari Hatcher as one of those starting wide receivers, which we sort of have been, leaning that way a little bit more over the past week. We sort of thought it was going to be Jackson Meeks, but we've noticed that Amari's been playing, with the first string guys a little bit more. That was certainly a surprise, I think, from where we were at the start of camp. Same with probably the tackles, Savion and Demetrius being on switched sides. I think we thought they'd start, but the fact that Weatherspoon is on the left is probably a surprise from the start of camp. But again, we've seen that coming. And the other reaction that I don't know if people are going to love to hear was like, I looked at the defensive tackle depth and I was sort of like, like they can't lose like a guy there. And, Fran talked about it a little bit. They're going to try to rotate bodies. They're going to hope that like fresh bodies really help at that position. Like they're playing some young guys. Some young guys are going to have to play snaps. And that's like a grown man, man strength, 3 years in the weight room position, and there's not a lot of depth there. So I think that's just something that'll be interesting to monitor, throughout the year.
Yeah, the tackle spot was definitely something that caught my eye too, just because there were so many names there, right? And if there had been one spot that we were a little hesitant on, it was that backup D line. I will say I did end up getting all of those names on there, in my depth chart projection last week. But I think the other thing, I mean, you kind of hit it with Hatcher, but over in the secondary, I was a little intrigued. Clarence Lewis won one of the starting cornerback roles over Jaden Bellamy, who's listed with an or next to Ibn McDaniels. And I will note here, in case fans missed it, kind of at the bottom of the depth chart, that the positions with an or listed next to them, or the names listed with an or next to them, those are in numerical order, just based on like jersey number. They don't have anything to do with like, oh, Bellamy's necessarily going to play more than McDaniels, or like Murad Watson is going to play more than Kevin Jobity Jr. Like,
and that is a great point with the tackles, right? That is
yes,
that is
maybe
why the freshmen were listed second rather than third potentially.
Right. Yeah. And so like there is like a little bit of a difference between like, so like I'm trying to think of a good position that we can pull this up. I guess I should pull it up on the screen, but like, so like if you look at that top edge rusher spot, like Fidel is the number one guy there, and then David and King Joseph have an or for that number 2 spot, right?
Yep.
Now down at both of the defensive tackle spots, Hastings, Watson, and Jobity, all of them are kind of competing and staying in the loop for that number 1 role because there's 2 ors listed there. So I know that can get a little tricky, a little confusing, but that's just a little clarification I wanted to provide. But yeah, the secondary was where I think I had some of my other kind of surprises. Like I said, Clarence Lewis won that starting spot. Barnes and Grant are still competing for that other secondary spot. And then you have Cornell Perry and Brahim Long in at strong safety behind Elijah Clark. And, bringing up Long and Marcellus Barnes, Chris, there were a lot of freshmen on this depth chart. Were you surprised? I think there was 9 total freshmen that we had on this depth chart. Did that shock you?
I was a little surprised, but a lot of them are ors, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a lot of maybe TBD in terms of like all right, is that spot evenly split? Like, is that person really the number two, or is that person the number three when it sort of comes game time? But yes, if we were looking at it like pure two deep, like I am surprised at the number of freshmen that I see listed, on the form. But I do think it's a little bit maybe TBD in terms of how much of a number two they are versus how much of a number three.
Yeah, the other notable thing obviously is like pretty much all of the transfers ended up on the depth chart. The only ones left off are Marcus Washington Jr., who just had surgery on his left bicep to repair a tear there. We found out, I think that was last week that we found that out from Fran. And then Justice Ross Simmons, who we can talk about for a minute. I know a lot
Michael
of people.
Michael Nwachakoa. I don't know if I
Oh
might be
yes,
butchering that
yes,
name, but also him.
him too. And then Justice Ross Simmons, who there's a lot of people I think confused on Twitter. I think we've been pretty good about talking about this, but if you did miss it, he was dealing with a hamstring pull throughout camp. I did listen back, and it was August 12th that Fran first addressed it, and at that time he seemed pretty optimistic Ross Simmons is going to be back that week. So it's like maybe a little concerning that he still isn't back to full health. But
And he's missed a lot of time. I mean, he's missed a lot of time too.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the ACC All Access, but I thought one of the telling moments was maybe Kyle and Umari working through a situation where he didn't love how Amari maybe ran the route and corrected him, and he hasn't had those same opportunities with Justice at this point. So, that's a little concerning, I would think.
Yeah. So he was left off mainly for that reason. It's not that they didn't think he was talented enough, right? Obviously, that's why they brought him in. They think he's talented. So that was kind of I think the one big exclusion that a lot of people were concerned about or confused about. Other than that, this depth chart, pretty standard. And I will say, Syracuse fans, you are lucky to see a depth chart at all, an official depth chart, because we did see quite a few programs today not release them. I know Clemson isn't releasing one because they're playing Georgia, and Georgia doesn't often release one. I saw a tweet from ESPN's David Hale that there are 7 ACC teams who haven't announced starting quarterbacks yet. So having Kyle McCord locked in, and that's your guy, that's good for Syracuse.
It's fascinating. It just seems like such an important. I know there's game planning stuff, but it also seems like. I guess if the competition is that close, maybe you don't name it. But it just seems there's we've seen the way that being named the starter has allowed Kyle to sort of take the reins from a leadership perspective, and I do think there has to be value in everybody knowing that's our leader, that's our guy. Syracuse, despite the fact that he's brand new, that's the vibe.
Kyle's obviously would come up in this conversation, but I'm going to take him out of this prompt and ask you, Chris, looking at the depth chart, who are maybe 1 to 2 to 3 names that you're okay, seeing where they are on the depth chart and who else is below them, these are guys that Syracuse cannot lose this season.
I think number one for me, outside of Kyle, is Fadil. We just he's the one guy on the defensive line who it feels like we know, can do it at a pretty high level at Syracuse. Deion Wilson was pretty successful, but it was at New Mexico. They've got transfers that come from big programs, but didn't see the field. So Fadil is sort of the only guy that has that combination of pedigree and production at the Power 5 level. That I know that he's going to be a good, at minimum, defensive lineman, and I don't know about anybody else. And I think Deion Wilson, he's older, he's done it. At New Mexico, they played Auburn, and he had a pretty good game against Auburn last year. Physically, he looks the part. He looks like a Power 5 defensive tackle. Those two guys for me are big because I seeing all those freshmen on that 2D might have just scared me. I don't like the idea of true freshmen or redshirt freshmen playing those big boy positions.
Yeah, I think mine is probably also on the line, but over on the offensive line, I think it's really both of the tackle spots, but especially left tackle. Behind Weatherspoon, you have Josh Miller and then Trevion Mack, and Miller obviously came from Georgia, and Mack has been here, but those are both younger guys. I mean,
Mhm.
they're both 15 plus pounds lighter than Weatherspoon, and with the O line, it is interesting because really it's less of like those two might not end up being the guys that would go in if Weatherspoon was hurt.
Yeah,
It
it could
might be
be
that they
Enrique,
move.
right?
It could be Enrique. It could be that they move Savion over to left tackle and then put Enrique in at right tackle.
Right.
But like, you really just don't want your O line to have to move around at all, if possible. Like, you want those guys to stay in the positions they've been practicing, stay next to the guy that they're used to pulling blocks with and stuff like that. So I think both of those. And then I know we heard some good things about him in camp, and I would love to see him prove me wrong or show out a little bit. But behind Deuce, like Barry Buxton, we just haven't really seen much of him yet, right? Like, we
Sure.
heard about him in camp, but I didn't necessarily see a lot to be like, okay, like this is a guy who can back up Deuce Chestnut and fit in well with those two other safeties there in Justin and Elijah Clark. So I think those are probably my two. Yeah, we didn't just talk about the depth chart with Fran this morning, though. Obviously, other things came up. It was a lot of like very philosophical, like kind of broad topics. The Syracuse Sports Insiders know Brent kind of texted and was like, I think all of us are ready for football because today was a lot of rehashing some things we've already heard. But Chris, was there one thing that you heard, maybe you asked about, that you did think was insightful or want to share with the group?
It was interesting. I was just struck by like, and I'm sure it's like this for football teams if it's like this for us. Like the coach speak just like sounded better because like I haven't heard it 20 times. So like when Fran was talking about, 10-win Ohio, and he's just like, well, I consider them better than us because like they won 10 games, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't won 10 games. Uh,
Yep.
and it's like, okay, like that's just coach speak, right? That is just complimenting the opponent and flattering. But it was just hearing it in a different voice, in a different way, like was like less old. Like I wasn't as inclined to just like dismiss it. I was like a little bit more engaged with it. And like it must be the same for players, like where they
Yeah.
hear not to dwell on the past, but like you hear hippos and elephants, whatever, for like the 100th time, and it just has to mean less, right? Like, um, so that and like it did like even the coach speak felt more genuine, right? Like the
Hmm.
genuine vibe that Fran gets credit for, like even in the coach speak moments, like that sort of like felt true to me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like one thing that Fran has said a couple times now, as we've gotten closer to the season, is like, that's my secret. I can't tell you my secret. And that is very much like kind of like a coach speak thing. But it's at least like just straight to the point of like, no,
Yeah,
I consider that valuable information. I'm not going to tell you that right now. Whereas other coaches, previous coach, like would have just kind of talked you in circles for a couple minutes and you would have been like, that didn't answer my question, or like I can't tell if like he was trying to answer it and just didn't understand. Like Fran's just like, no, I'm not going to tell you that, which is a lot easier to then, okay, like, well, I'm just going to move on from that, or I'm going to ask about something different instead. So that I yes, it does sound different, the coach speak now.
and also I think I don't know, right? This is a me thing more than probably anybody who's watching this cares about. But like, you know, there also wasn't like, why are you asking me that? Or like, I expect you to understand that that's secret information. It was just like, all right,
Hmm.
you can ask whatever you want, but like that's one of my secrets. And I think he handles that very deftly. He's talked a lot about um, this. The other funny thing he said, which is true, right? We're all in the honeymoon phase. Like we love Fran, Fran loves us. Like everybody's saying nice things. When the losses start hitting and the questions get a little bit tougher, it'll maybe be a little bit different. It was fun and cool, I think, to see that he recognizes that, right? Like he knows how it works. He knows what's going on
Mhm.
right now, and we're in the era of good times, and those don't last forever.
Right. Well, I mean, last week when we went up and did our scrum with him, like he opened his scrum and he was kind of telling us about something like he'd prefer us like doing something a certain way in terms of how we were covering camp, right? Which is just stuff you listen out, and obviously as journalists we decide, okay, are we gonna adhere to that? Are we gonna keep moving throughout it? But what really struck me is him just saying like, I understand that you guys have a job,
Yeah.
and like I do my job, you guys do your job, and like you have a job. And just like that simple understanding, where it felt like sometimes in the past couple years it would be like Dina would be like, well, why are you asking a question? It's like, well, it's my job to ask the question about that. And so I thought that was really telling. And then yeah, he had the quote this morning that was like, well, you guys are tough and I know you're only going to get tougher after game one. So he knows what's coming down the line, in post game and stuff like that. I think that's like I said, a lot of the press conference stuff was very overarching. You know, there's some good quips about like the dome atmosphere and getting excited to go in there and stuff like that. We do have a couple more pods coming down the chute this week, and I think we'll be using some of this in there as well. So let's go ahead and turn it over and talk about the final episode of ACC All-Access with Syracuse football, which aired tonight. One of the segments was all about Fran Brown and Elijah Robinson's relationship, and they had some nice vintage photographs of Elijah Robinson. I got this one of my own that I snapped from Mark Peace's binder of newspaper clippings. Mark Peace was Fran and then also Robinson's coach for a brief amount of time back when they were both in high school. And it's hard to see him in this because of the photo, but he's that one all the way back on the far right over there. So wanted to throw that in there. But Chris, what was your instant reactions to this final episode?
I enjoyed the moments, and I really wish they could have been like. I understand why they weren't, right? But like when Kyle was explaining to Umari maybe like what he didn't like about the route, like I would have loved to have seen it, right? To know like what he is talking about. Like I would just love to learn. I would love that opportunity to like learn what stood out to Kyle in that moment. But it was still like sort of cool to see like the communication process and how that works between two teammates. I think that was my favorite part, and like that and just Kyle's sort of earnest reaction to like Arande making like plays, right? Where he's just like, oh man, he's disgusting. Like, all right, like that's good. Like that is a good sign. And Barron had the same reaction. Justin Barron had a similar reaction like when they put the all ACC teams out and like Kyle wasn't on it, and he was just like so offended because he sees Kyle every day and he believes in him to that degree. So certainly as fans, like we are in talking season and everything's great until it's not. But like, those honest reactions would make me feel optimistic.
Yeah, this episode felt like a little bit of rehash on some things to me. Like there was a couple segments where we did kind of go over things that I felt like we had seen previously, but there was definitely some fun stuff in it. I thought, obviously, like the college football 25 game is something players have gotten some questions of throughout camp and stuff, but it was fun to see them playing it and really talking and smiling about themselves, and everyone complaining about their speed ranking, which was the number one chief complaint about everyone's player profiles, and Zede Haynes takes the cake there, though I guess Malachi James will probably be the highest speed rating next year whenever that game comes
100,
out.
100 whenever
Yeah.
that update comes out.
That's another true freshman who made the depth chart. He's going to be on kick return with Trevor Pena and a couple others. You mentioned obviously some of the Gadsden stuff, but Gadsden is primarily who we saw in those final scrimmage highlights. Particularly impressive was that kind of one-handed falling grab he had near the back of the end zone that I think it was then right after that then they flashed to Justin on the sideline being like, all right, I need a pick now. I need a pick, and like really wanting to go for it. And then we got some defensive highlights. I was kind of hoping like they would play that segment more like it was an actual game and give us like a little score bug at the bottom and let us know, like, I guess like maybe that's something that they wanted to keep a little under wraps, like if like who won that game or which side of the ball might be better. But it was nice to get a little bit into that.
One other
and
thing
see
that I
some of the
did
scrimmage.
One other thing that I did find interesting, and I wish it had explored a little more, what was Aranda Gaston sort of had this offhand comment about like, we're not afraid to hit or we're not afraid of physicality anymore. And like, it was like, oh, like, you were? Or like that was the impression sort of you had of like the team as a whole. And right, maybe that's not how he meant it, but that's like sort of how it struck me that he was discussing it as a change.
Yeah, that's how they framed it. And I mean, like, context wise, like it could have been like, oh, we've previously been afraid to like hit in scrimmages because people get injured and we have an injury problem, and like
or
that would have been
because depth is a problem, which has very much been a problem.
Yeah, those would have been very different kind of contexts to lay that out in. So that was a very interesting answer. And we got to see a little bit of the physicality and not being afraid to hit anymore, right, when they were doing the one-on-one drills. And I thought the matchups were engaging and fun. I think it was Tank and John Ray Reed, and then JB and LeQuint, and I think OG and King Joseph Edwards, I think, were the three that we saw.
That sounds correct.
And all were pretty like well fought. Like none of those guys got beat. They were just pretty aggressive. We like were there for one of those, but because of how they all stand around each other,
we couldn't see anything. We heard some yelling. Just heard a lot of yelling.
Yeah, we just had to like I was like trying to get on my tiptoes, but could not see anything. Yeah, I think it was a fun 3 episodes. I think if I had to pick a favorite, I think 2 was maybe the strongest, like in terms of just like kind of moments we hadn't seen. I did have to remember I was watching with our coworker and breaking news reporter Ann Hayes, who obviously is not around the team to the same capacity she was, and she was like, I get why you feel like some of this is just like kind of basic stuff, but this is really fun because I don't know any of these guys. So like that was something I was having to keep in mind as we went through. It's like, okay, we're talking to LeQuint on the daily or Justin on the daily and kind of know these guys' personalities and know that Justin and Kyle like to golf and all of these things. But it's a different insight for the fans. And I think from what we saw, a lot of the fans really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and it is right. I'm sure the goal is to broaden it to the whole ACC. The hope is that you'll pick up casual fans. So certainly everybody that listens to you all the time, probably, didn't learn a ton that was new, but saw it, right? Which there is something with seeing it with your own eyes that, it's true when you see it. But yeah, that it has to be sort of tailored to a much more broad audience than the hardcore, diehard football fan who's waiting for you to go live on your podcast 3 times a week.
Yeah. Chris, was there any question that you wanted them to answer in the show, or like moment you wished you saw, whether it was something that we actually saw or it was like a hypothetical, that you were like, oh dang, I wish we had seen this? Because they were there for like, that crew was there for a month and had some very long filming days from what we heard, and pretty much all we saw was like exclusively practice and interviews, and then a few locker room shots, the clip of Fran at practice. But was there anything like that comes to mind for you?
Just as somebody who would love to learn and know more about the sport, like maybe some like I would have loved like a little bit of X's and O's where we could see exactly what they were talking about. And I know that's probably tricky because like you don't want to give away too much scheme, but like there had to be some sort of moment where they were just discussing like routes and how they work together, or how they play off one another, that maybe they could have shown us, and like we all could have learned a little bit more about football.
Mhm.
But again, that is maybe not tailoring it to the broad audience that I just talked about.
I mean, we know that they watched. I forget which side of the ball. I'm assuming it was both sides of the ball, just based on what little we know about the scheme. But we know they did watch like some like pro footage to like and pro film and kind of dissected that to help learn these new schemes. So like that could have been a way into that without obviously giving trade secrets out to Ohio or Georgia Tech or whoever wanted to go and watch and see what they were doing in the film room. I agree. I think what I would have maybe wanted a little bit more was just like in the building stuff, like the meetings, the planning, the late nights doing whatever. And obviously like some of that gets a little too proprietary, or like you said, maybe gets a little bit too in depth for the common viewer. But I like just knowing how long, and like, we heard, I've said this before, but we heard one night they were there until 3 a.m. and we never found out, like, I guess unless it was the shoe burning, but I don't think that was taking place at 3
Right.
a.m. Like,
Right.
it was like, what were they doing there until 3 a.m.? Who was at the facility? So that was maybe my one thing.
One of the other, I mean, and this is my fault because I asked I asked a poorly worded question today, and didn't get a great answer. Um, but like they brought in like 40 plus new guys, um, because they can now, right? That there's
Mm-hmm.
no set sizes on freshman classes. The transfer portal exists. Like, so this is literally one of the largest 1 year overhauls of personnel that a college football team has ever had.
Mm-hmm.
Not the most because Deion Sanders is crazy, and Louisville's done a lot of it too. But like, it's up there. It is a huge, huge 1 year switch. Um, and I would love to know a little bit like how much did that shape their off season? Like how many things did they do to build chemistry that they wouldn't do in a normal year, or wish they didn't have to do in a normal year, but it was like something they had to do this year. And maybe I'll eventually get that question out in a way that Fran answers it in the way that I want him to. But I'm fascinated by that whole idea, I guess.
He did have a good quote. At least I wrote down break it better. He's of the mentality that it's not just if it's broke, fix it. It's if it's okay, fix it and make it better. If it's good, fix it and make it better, and keep breaking it and making better, which tells you a little bit. I think that's not everyone subscribes to that mentality, but
Yep.
yet knowing what you're going for and what you're trying to turn, I understand. And all of our Syracuse.com readers should get to understand that later in the week. Chris, it's game week. What are you most looking forward to about Saturday? Getting to see football again, I think, is number one at the top of everyone's list. But anything else?
I think I just want to see the offense. Um, and maybe that's just 'cause I'm a basic football fan and I don't pay enough attention to defense and appreciate the nuances that are involved in defense. But like, we've heard pro style, pro style, pro style, but like, what does that look like in real life? We might not see much of it against Ohio. We'll find out. Like, they might be able to get through it playing pretty vanilla. But is that motions? Is that like personnel groupings? Like, what exactly is sort of that pro style approach going to look like?
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued by the offense too. Kyle McCord, everyone's been talking about. They're trying to get him to run more. They're trying to get him to be little league Kyle. We'll see if he actually does run more. We'll see if he's more mobile.
I
Chris, you don't
really
think so?
like long term. I really want to I want to see that.
Yeah.
Like he knows that's where he needs to get better. Like the Pro Football Focus numbers say he was terrible under pressure. Like he clearly has been working to improve it, but like where does it end up this season? Like how much better can he be? Like I'm fascinated by that whole sort of experiment that he's gonna go through.
As we get closer to Saturday and game one, if you have opinions on what you're most looking forward to, or questions about the game, or if you're at the game and have thoughts about it, you can text us on the Syracuse Sports Insider line, and you can join that by texting Orange to 315-847-3895. It's a 2-week free trial and then $3.99 a month after that, and that gets you pretty much direct access to at least Brent and I. Chris will get passed on info that we find out on the text line, or contribute things that come that go out to the texters. So certainly, if you're looking for the inside look at Syracuse football, you will want to be a Syracuse Sports Insider. But I think that's all we have for tonight. Chris, thank you for hopping on. It's our last probably this late Monday night pod for a while, though. Brent and I will be doing post-game pods again this year, and
so we'll have some
we might not have the Pac-12 After Dark anymore, but we have the
Emily
Syracuse Sports Podcast After Dark. So luckily these first few games are early for us, and will be a little bit easier, but we will get to that point when it's about a 1 a.m., 2 a.m. podcast. So for Chris Carlson, I'm Emily Leiker, and this was the Syracuse Sports Podcast. Thanks for joining us, you guys.